The divisional round has come and gone. It's been a few days to digest what's happening, and now we're getting ready for the conference finals weekend. Before we go too far into it, though, I wanted to take a second, maybe look back at last week, how that impacted the NFL, but more importantly, how it impacts this pool. So before we get to the forward, we do have to look behind. So let's take a quick look at each of the games that brought us here last weekend. I'll go over each of the games as they hit us. The very first game on the Saturday was the Texans at the Ravens. Now, don't roll your eyes, North American people. I understand if you're a football fan, you probably watched all 4 of these games. When I say this part, I'm going to explain a little bit because I did watch all the games, but I know not everyone probably got a chance to. That is because you're dealing with people internationally that could be 6, 8, 12, 13 hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time. So some of these games are challenging to watch. So you can tell, though, if people watch this game or if they just looked at the box score. In the first half, it was actually slightly closer than you'd think. Now, at no point in time did the Texans ever look like they were going to win the game, but they were actually converting on a few third downs. CJ Stroud made a couple really tough passes. The pressure was certainly on them, so they didn't get a whole lot going on the run game unless it was something that was a little bit more dry, like there wasn't very traditional how they were getting a lot of their yards. But they did convert initially a lot of third downs until their line just didn't see it coming, right? I think the number of false starts, they were definitely in over their head. If you've ever coached a team that just suddenly is playing in front of a large stadium and their eyes are this big, you could tell the second they walked in, Texans were going to struggle and penalties kind of killed them. But even if they didn't, the Ravens did look pretty fierce. I don't think it necessarily cost them the game, but just maybe cost some people some points, especially Shea, who had Nico Collins, or unfortunately, I told you last week, if you didn't know Mike Pollock, he's very much if you're not first, you might as well be last in these pools. He swung for the fences with his sub. He took CJ Stroud, hoping that if there was an upset, the 7 people who had Lamar and all the people who have Gus the Bus and Likely and Zay Flowers, almost forgot the name there, that they would go down and he'd have one of the few people lasting. Unfortunately, not only did CJ Stroud have the quarterback 8 performance, which was our lowest ranked performance of the week in terms of total points, he's also out. So that puts Mike in a very difficult position. I don't want to say he's mathematically out of it because I haven't done the math, but he is likely mathematically out of it. Sorry, Mikey. On the Baltimore side, like I said, a lot of people did have some of the skill position players, not as much as some of the other big teams. But Lamar Jackson, 7 people do have him, and they enjoyed the fact that he was the quarterback 1. I believe he scored 40 points in our point structure. That's the highest score we've had of any player. He already jaunted himself into the top 5 in quarterbacks, which we'll take a look at in a second, overall for the playoffs, even though he's only played 1 week. He had 100 yards on the ground with 2 touchdowns, and he threw for 2 touchdowns. That line has not been seen for a couple of years now. It was Colin Kaepernick who did it last, who I know a lot of people in the NFL seem to be forgiven for doing a ton of heinous things, and he, for whatever reason, has not been given a second shot. Rumor has it, though, with Harbaugh coming back to the Chargers, keep an eye on that one. Apparently, he's already contacted about maybe doing some backup reps. That could just be rumors, though. Who knows? Anywho, Baltimore looked like they were flying for the majority of the game. Definitely for those who have Lamar as one of their 2 quarterbacks still kicking, or maybe their only quarterback left, you were hoping it goes as long as possible because it just looks like their offense essentially runs through him. And game 1, off to a good start. For game 2, you would think it was the same thing with San Francisco, but of course it was not. I don't know if it's like the bad guys and M. Night Shyamalan's signs or the Wicked Witch, whichever one it was in The Wizard of Oz that was melted. Water does not seem to go well with the San Francisco offense. You couldn't see it from all camera angles, but if you caught within the light, it was raining pretty heavily in San Francisco last weekend, and their offense just did not look great. Now, CMC Music Factory, Christian McCaffrey, we all have him except for one team. He was great. He was our running back 1, and he was fine. He was unfazed. Deebo Samuel got hurt early and often. He actually kept trying to come back in the game. He got pulled. As of recording right now, I've been holding off as long as I could. I have heard he's supposed to go this weekend, which if you're a San Francisco 49er fan or you are one of the many people who have a lot of 49ers in this pool, that makes you happy because if you followed the 49ers this year, I'll get into a little bit about the MVP voting near the end, but their offense just works better with everyone in it, and Deebo Samuel is such a huge factor. They have a lot of kind of set plays for him because Brendan Ayuk didn't get it going. Kittle got 14 points in our structure, which was pretty good, and Purdy had, I think, the second lowest quarterback for someone who had a little bit of hype coming in. That was not what people were looking for. Terms of the Packers, nobody, I believe, in this league took a Packer, but Aaron Jones, is still our RB1, I think, and probably until McCaffrey passes him this weekend. Injury, without injuries or anything crazy happening. But they definitely, for any Packers fan, you got to be looking at next year with a lot more positives. This was definitely a game that they put up a good fight. They actually had control of it at one point, and I've heard some suggest that they actually kind of did outplay the 49ers, especially in large parts. If it wasn't for Purdy getting it together on that last drive and them marching down, there were times when honestly I thought this was going the other way and our number one seed in the NFC was going to go out, which would have made this pool very interesting. Because as you know, there's several of you out there that have your teams pretty much built around your 49ers. Moving on to Sunday, we had a similar kind of idea. Although instead of nobody having a Packer, which I believe is true, very few people have any Buccaneers. It's actually just my dogs that took White and Evans, who both went off for great performances. White with a top 5 running back performance, and Evans was our wide receiver 1 after last week with 20 points. A few people do have the Lions, though. Some people have jumped on the Goff bandwagon here and had that as, including my dogs, who took it as their sub pick. A few people have Gibbs, one has Monty. St. Brown is a common wide receiver pick. So probably our pool was swinging more on the Lions side. And they really just benefited from having the home field. They certainly did not look like they controlled this game, but they definitely had kind of the momentum throughout most of it. But got to give it to Baker. Remember, this is a battle of the former number 1 overall picks in Baker versus Goff. And Baker held his own, right? I think whatever he needed last year in terms of that rejuvenation when he played for the Rams and he got his legs underneath him again for that short stint, his confidence seems to be back and the team kind of believed in him. So this was actually a closer game than I think a lot of people were suggesting, which I'll get into more when I start looking at next week's matchup. But Detroit really rode that home field advantage. They took all the momentum they needed, and so it really wasn't super close. There was a few moments where it could have been a little bit tighter, but in the end, Lions held out. So that's our other 3 seed going to the conference championship. Now, the game that most people focused on, and for good reason, we did have the Chiefs going over the Bills. I mentioned last week that this would be a bigger loss for the Bills than win for the Chiefs, and I actually think I'm right on that one. Now, I'm not going to just pile it on. I know we have a few Bills fans present here in the pool, so I'll be sensitive to that. I'm not the kind of person who likes to spike the ball because honestly, that loss sucks. I mean, it kind of made me miss being in like a pub in North America, watching it with a bunch of people. Well, people who hopefully aren't obnoxious and know what they're talking about, because it was definitely a game at the end that left you with so many but what ifs, right? You know, I mean, the game didn't have to be that close. If for whatever reason the Chiefs decided when they were running it down their throats with Pacheco, then they go, they give Hardman a chance, who had more fumbles than he did yards, and he coughs it up, and then everyone got into a discussion about what it's like to fumble the ball through the end zone and why it's a touchback, and is that a rule that's going to be changed? You have Diggs, who's been complaining for years about being on losing side of things and having all this talent, and he can't hang on to a ball, especially one that was, pretty much would have been a game breaker. Gabe Davis even dropped one that was probably reasonably all right, that was catchable for him. So they didn't make that one. And then obviously the biggest what if that field goal goes in, and then what would have Mahomes done with that much time and timeouts? You got to feel for them, though. I mean, base has been great all year, and you kind of felt, though, something was in the air. I wish you could just turn back time and be like, look, you're a Buffalo Bill. You can't miss this to the right. There's just no way. Hook it, slam it into the line, get it blocked, kick it into the stands and hit the mascot in the nards. Whatever you have to do, just don't go wide right. Now we got a whole new generation. Poor Base. He had to drop all social media accounts because the Bills Mafia turned on him pretty heavily. I will say, for people who bash Taylor Swift and the Swifties, apparently he is an ambassador for something called the 10 Lives Club, which is a cat space charity in Buffalo. And Taylor Swift fans have raised, I think, almost $250,000 and given it to him in his name as a, sorry, you're getting bullied online kind of situation. But at least he had something to do with it. Poor Scott Norwood all of a sudden has a whole new generation Googling who he is and why he shanked a field goal in the Super Bowl. So he has to relive that every once in a while. So super unfortunate. Now, in terms of our pool, it does actually add, right? Now, not only is this just a massive, years ago, Bill Simmons, someone who I follow, he used to write, now he's just more on podcasting and whatnot. He wrote an article kind of comparing the levels of losses and, the ones that just irk you versus the ones that like the stomach punch. And he gave names to it all and gave examples. This is a new one though, a deja vu stomach punch. Like we've seen this again. Going to be hard to see how the Bills kind of bounce back from this next year and what they choose to do. That'll be interesting. But in terms of our pool, 7 people had Allen. So obviously that's going to, if you already used your sub, that's a quarterback out. 8 people had Diggs, and actually 9 people had Cook, because the running back pool isn't as deep in some of these teams. So massively hard hit, does shape the nature of our pool a little bit. And like I said, for Mahomes, really it's at this point just dealing with house money. Now, I think the other thing that takes all the attention away from this game was the Taylor Swift booth, but in this particular case, and I'm calling it that because, come on, that's what 90% of the shots are, but not this week. It was a Kelsey booth for sure. I think it's hilarious how different it's covered when we have just like a pop star in there versus a shirtless retired football brother who decides to jump into the stands and be lifting fans up and cheering and going up. Just a great way to meet your potential future sister-in-law. I think that's awesome. I was reading a little bit more about his infamous speech years ago after the Eagles won, where he made a very drunk speech to Philadelphia and essentially made himself an icon in Philadelphia Eagles' eyes forever. He said at that point he was north of 20 beers and he was only a 5 on the drunkenness scale. I want to call it, though, if you looked at the beer in his hand, they were light beers. I mean, if you're that big, you don't need beer-flavored water. Drink the real stuff, and maybe you won't get to 20, is my only suggestion for Senor Kelsey. Other than that, no notes. You just keep being you. Looked great. Speaking of our pool, though, before I get into next week's games and a few things to look out for, let's just see how exactly that manifested in our pool and what we got going on heading into the last week. Before I get to the spreadsheet that I've shared with everybody and the one that has our final totals in everyone's team, I have been keeping some of my own stats as I'm suggesting. So this is just how week 2 went. So the divisional round, we see here my dogs are on number 1. Now, before I think it's weird, if you've never been in my March Madness pool, number 1, you should get in. It's a lot of fun. But number 2, I usually pick a gut pick and give my dogs a bracket. I don't do that thing where I put treats on the ground and they go from one side to the other. These are my picks. It's just I approach it in different ways, so don't feel weird if you're losing to my dogs. My dad got in the second spot, Chainer 4, Jake, and then Corbin rounds out our top 5, but we see it starts to get a little bit tight. We do kind of have some unlucky folks. Like I mentioned, Mikey Pollock did take a swing and a miss on CJ Stroud, and Matt actually didn't get his sub in on time, unfortunately, so sorry, Matt, but Matt represents one of our 3 people, Shea being another one. Now, Shea's in a bit of a different spot because he had Purdy and Lamar from the beginning, and a lot of people have used their sub for a quarterback. That's except for Chainer and Ben, who both took Ayuk last week as their sub. So I don't know if he's waiting for a quarterback to see if both of them make it or not, but he still has his sub. The third person is actually my dad here, who's done quite well without his sub. He did have both quarterbacks still firing. He actually had both quarterbacks in the Bills-Kansas City matchup, so now one of them's out, and he has the choice coming into this weekend whether he wants to take his sub now or later. As it kind of breaks down, before I get to, again, the spreadsheet that I've shared with everyone, just take a quick look on how that broke down for this week. Lamar, like I said, was our number 1 with 40 points, quite exceptional. Allen, 32, so he was number 1 and number 2, so he's still our number 1 overall quarterback. Baker, though, I told you, he's been number 3 2 weeks in a row. He's been a huge point getter. He will get passed likely by Lamar, Mahomes, possibly Goff and Purdy, depending on how things roll. But he definitely has overperformed, I think, as most people have probably gauged. As I mentioned, Jones is technically our running back 1. It would surprise me if he doesn't get passed. I mean, Pacheco's been double digits each time. That would make him pass. Christian McCaffrey had 24 coming out of the gate, so if he does that again, he will be up there as well. Gibbs obviously is still in the hunt. I told you White was a top 5. He is, so well done to my dogs for taking him there. But I think this will end up kind of siphoning out some of the people who had outstanding performances versus the people who are still kicking. Now, wide receiver has actually been a thinner position than you think. As I mentioned, Evans was our number 1. Kelsey was actually our receiver / tight end 2. Kittle being 3. So tight ends, you benefit here. That's the column here if you're confused. But our overall, Dobbs, not taken by anyone because he had a monster first week, and Jake the Snake Ferguson still is our overall number 2, just edging out Kelsey, but I would expect that to change because we have Kelsey, St. Brown, we still have Rice in the mix, so there could be some people jumping up here, but with Ayuk having a massively disappointing output with only 3 points and Debo getting hurt and only having 2, it'll be interesting to see the people who took a lot of 49ers, will they last long enough to kind of make up that difference. Looking at our spreadsheet, the one we can take a look at. So not only did my dogs actually have a phenomenal week, but they did just edge out Jake for currently the top spot with my dad 3rd, Jim 4th, and Chainer 5th. So congrats there. We see here just the subs, yes and no. I already know that if I'm doing this next year, which I'd love to, I've had a good time with this pool, I'm going to do this differently, not make you do math with numbers out. I'll have numbers in plus subs, so it's a little easier to discern. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Just in terms of the subs, if you took a look, just going in order on the bottom here, it was the people who took Purdy were quite high. He was our most common sub taken. Corbin took him, Jake took him, Horst took him, Jim took him, Rushke took him, V1 also took Purdy as their sub. I already mentioned Ayuk. V2 and my dogs took Goff as their sub coming in, and I already mentioned Mikey, and that left me, which actually took Mahomes as my sub, and we'll see how that goes, although I'm just hanging on by a thread. I've already lost 9 people, so has V1, so has Mike Pollock, so we are already down to 4 people getting us points, and knowing that one of them is McCaffrey and one of them is that everyone has him, unfortunately, I would say the 3 of us are very, very unlikely. The only person who might still crack it, someone like Jim, who only has 8 left, but his total points are quite high. So if things go south for everyone and he has a few players, he could squeak. Because a few of us up here, my dogs included and my dad, have taken some people off the beaten path. So it's not just they're all completely relying on the 49ers like a lot of people are at this stage. I'm not going to go team by team, so please do take a look and see what people around you have. But I will just mention quarterbacks before I cut to the last little part here. Again, just going in order at the bottom. Corbin still has Purdy and Lamar left. Chainer's got Lamar. Jake's got Purdy. My dad has Mahomes and a possible sub if he wants to use it. I have Mahomes. Horst has Mahomes and Purdy. Shay's got Lamar and Purdy, as I mentioned. Mikey's got nada. Matt currently has nobody, but he does have his sub. Jim's got Purdy. Reshke's got Lamar and Purdy. V1 has Purdy. V2 has Lamar and Goff. So take a look. Maybe he make a run there with 2 quarterbacks. My dogs also have Lamar and Goff, and Ben's got Lamar left. So while all the other positions are going to factor in, obviously the quarterbacks do tend to give us more points if they do their job correctly. That does not a guarantee. So just wanted to kind of lay that out there. If you're doing your math, you can go through, take a look who's around you, take a look who they have, so you know not just who you're cheering for, but maybe who you're also cheering against. Speaking of that, though, let's get to our last 2 matchups of the week, our semifinals, and let's see what lies ahead. As we head into the conference championships, which will obviously be a big week for our pool with the second last, we've got 3 games left of football. I'll go in the order that they're popping up. I believe AFC goes first on Sunday. So we're looking at the Chiefs at the Ravens. A rare situation. Now, last week I did say all the pressure being on the Bills and the Chiefs are playing with house money. Even more so this week, how is it that our reigning Super Bowl champions kind of have a carte blanche? If they lose, they're supposed to lose. It's the Ravens at home. If they win, just put Mahomes in the hall right now and already get used to the narrative that's going to be over the next 2 weeks with him versus Brady. Maybe he's already better, even though Brady lasted, a massively long career. This is just because we know that there's not much that they're dealing with in terms of a receiver core. We know that the team itself is quite depleted. We know there's going to be offensive line injuries, apparently. Their defense, though, is a top 5 defense, so they have a shot of keeping it in there. In fact, of our 4 teams left, 3 are effectively ranked 1, 2, 3, and then there's the Lions in the 20th. I'll get to them in a second. But they really walk in with nothing to lose. So if Kelsey and Mahomes can pull this off for the Chiefs, even if it doesn't end up being them as the reason why they win, this is huge for Kansas City and their legacy. In terms of Baltimore, all the pressure is on them. They are the overwhelming favorites. I think if they're playing anyone else other than the Chiefs, it is more than a 3.5 point spread, which is, I believe it is right now on a lot of online books. And that's just because the Baltimore Ravens are effectively a analytics darling, right? You've got the lowest. So they've allowed the least amount of points. They were ranked first in the league, least amount rushing, and they've scored more than 25 a game. Apparently, the only other teams that have done that in the past, 72 Dolphins and the 85 Bears. If you look at the teams that they've played throughout the year that made the playoffs, only the almost undefeated Pats can say the same thing that the Ravens can say, that they're plus minus. They're over plus 100. They're over 100 points in the positive this year when they're playing against teams that made the playoffs. So not only are they supposed to win, but they're supposed to win by double digits. Now, again, though, this is a classic matchup of analytics say this should not be close. Baltimore runs away with it. But your gut has a really hard time betting on anyone against Mahomes. So this is kind of old school, new school in a way. Does analytics kind of hold all that value, or does sometimes the things that we can't measure matter more? So I'm not trying to make this a old person versus young person game, but I would be shocked if that doesn't come up as a narrative at some point in time. Moving on to the NFC game, as I mentioned, Detroit's kind of the odd person out here. All 3 defenses that I mentioned, San Francisco, Baltimore, Kansas City are all quite high statistically. Detroit's is not in almost every facet. You're looking at things like average points, yards allowed on the ground, yards allowed in the air. One of the biggest ones that could burn, for people who have Ayuk, you might like to hear this one. Detroit just does tend to give up a big game to the number one and deep threat receiver on the other team. You can go through, I mean, the CeeDee Lambs in the world got it on everyone, but they got 200 plus on Detroit. Look at the last couple weeks in the playoffs. They were often, they were weak to somebody who had a little bit of skill set, can get open deep. And so San Francisco could take advantage of that. The problem, I think, with San Francisco in that front is it's not just Ayuk. I mean, Deebo Samuel they use sometimes out there. Kittle can find a seam and go deep. McCaffrey can beat one guy and everything is on the goal line essentially for him. He can always score from any point in the field. So this could be dangerous on the defensive front for the Lions. In terms of flipping the script, Jared Goff completes about 53% of his passes over the middle. And that's where San Francisco is actually at its best. There's a couple linemen there that might be lighting up some receivers. So again, I think we have a situation where if you look at the numbers, this one shouldn't really be that close in San Francisco, especially if everyone's healthy. But as we saw last week, I think the Lions are a better team than the Packers. Anything can really happen. But in theory, I think this is one of those rare weeks where normally there's a little bit more of a narrative. But if you had to bet 1,000 of your own money and you had to put a two game parlay on, you're not taking the points just straight up. I think most people go with the number one seeds here instead of the number threes, and I think you get that Baltimore versus San Francisco Super Bowl matchup. But that's why we play. So it could end up being this. It could be just paint, or we could get some interesting subplots. We'll see what happens here. It'll also be, might be interesting to see what happens to the Purdy narrative. I know after last week, some people are down on him. It's a really funny bit. I was reading a little bit and listening to a bunch of people online. It is funny with Purdy that we're so quick to say what he's not versus what he is. It's weird to say that, hey, you're a good quarterback, especially someone who was Mr. Irrelevant, that some people take that as a slight because you're not referring to him as like an MVP. In my mind, Christian McCaffrey is the MVP of this league. And I think because we give it to the best quarterback, and that's who actually wins the MVP award often, unless there's a record-breaking statistical anomaly of a season from a running back or wide receiver, it goes to Lamar Jackson. And I think that's fine. But like Purdy's good enough. He does the job. He's fine, and I do think though that people, you want to make the alternative argument to try and make something that it's not. And I mean, Purdy does a great job. To say someone manages a game doesn't mean that they're limited, but I mean, he can't throw the ball the length of the field like Allen did, or take over the game like Allen did in that front. But that's fine. San Francisco doesn't need that. They have, the biggest asset to their team that they don't talk about enough is he gets paid nothing, right? He doesn't really get that guaranteed contract the first top 10 draft picks would get, because he has like the most comparable and the most team favorable contract in the league. I remember at some point in time, midway through the year, I was listening to someone that broke it down that said effectively for every point that like Dax gets, it costs the, Dallas like $1 million or something for every point that Purdy's responsible for. It was something like 25,000 or something like that. Like that's why they can build a team around him. That's why their defense is so expensive. That's why they can spend money elsewhere, is because they're not spending money at quarterback. So when his contract comes up, we'll really get to see what San Francisco thinks about him. If they honestly think he's a generational talent, then they'll spend money on him. If they don't, they'll let someone else spend money on him, and they'll go and draft another underrated quarterback to try and see what they can do there and have a more systems-based quarterback. But we'll see how it goes. You can't really trust anything you post or hear online. Trust me, as someone who's putting stuff online, there's no intelligence test to this. I just have to be willing to do it. So we'll see if some of the conspiracy theories that I've read are out there. There is one, if you haven't seen it. The last, I think, 4 years, when they released the Super Bowl logo midway through the year, the two colors that have been represented on the logo end up reflecting the two teams who end up making the Super Bowl. And so this is, all the people who say that NFL is just a script and it actually is influenced by the league, we'll see, because this year's was red and purple, which does suggest the 49ers and the Ravens. However, if you're calling an audible, if I'm running the NFL and I get to decide how this goes, why wouldn't I want a Detroit and Kansas City? Then you can just scrap your halftime plans, ditch Usher. And as someone who grew up with Usher, and probably the last time I was actually in a dance club, Usher was predominant in that experience, ditch them and have Eminem versus Taylor Swift as your halftime show. If you're the NFL, why don't you want that? So we'll see if any of these conspiracy theories and tinfoil wearing individuals can bear weight, and if there's any kind of or if there's any truth to any of it, but I doubt it. Either way, it's been super entertaining so far in the postseason, so I'm glad hopefully you've enjoyed the pool itself. Gives you a little bit more to bet on, a little bit more to pay attention to. Here's hoping that this gives us a little more clarity. I'll spend a little bit of time next week kind of going through who's got people left, but before I do any of that, let's just enjoy 2 of our last 3 games in the NFL season. Best of luck this week, and enjoy some good football.